Hello everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, HDR's Challenges and Opportunities for NSPs, sponsored by Technicolor. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. On the right-hand side of your screen is the Q&A. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can type your question into the Q&A box and submit your questions to our speakers. All questions will be saved, so if we don't get to answer you today, we may follow up via email. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget, so you can find answers to common questions. A copy of today's slide deck is available for download in the green Resource List widget. Towards the end of today's presentation, we'll ask for your feedback. A survey will pop open on your screen and will only take 1 minute to complete. Your feedback is extremely helpful. Finally, an on-demand version of the webcast will be available about 1 day after the event and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier today. I'd now like to turn the event over to Light Reading's Cable Video Practice Leader, Alan Bresnick. Alan?
Thanks, Hannah. Hello out there, everyone. Welcome to today's Light Reading webinar, which is entitled HDR's Challenges and Opportunities for Network Service Providers, or NSPs. As Hannah mentioned, my name is Alan Bresnick. I'm a contributing analyst at Heavy Reading, the research arm of Light Reading, and I'm also the Cable Video Practice Leader on the Light Reading side. I'll be your moderator today. Based outside Toronto, I specialize in the cable, video, and broadband technology markets. I've put together this webinar in tandem with our sole sponsor, Technicolor. We have a very solid program for you today, focusing on the potential of high dynamic range, or HDR, technology to transform the TV viewing experience and thereby the entire video industry. In this session, we will spell out what HDR is, how it works, and what its implications are for the industry. We'll examine the opportunities that the technology presents and examine the challenges that it raises for cable operators and other service providers. We'll explain how these technical challenges can be overcome, and we'll present some interesting case studies of how service and content providers are starting to leverage HDR's potential. Okay. So first we'll take a look at, I'm sorry, Hannah, could you move the slides for me for a second, please? My pointer isn't working. Okay, so move on to the next slide. We're going to talk about, still not happening. We're going to talk about some housekeeping tips here that I think Hannah already covered. They talk about how to optimize your experience today. Hannah already covered this, so I won't go through it in any detail. Let's move on right to our speakers today. Once I'm finished with my intro, our two main speakers will be Josh Lamore and Brian Jentz. The first one will be Josh Lamore. Josh is Vice President of Technology and Ecosystem Development from Technicolor. He will be joining us from Los Angeles today. Next, we'll hear from Brian Jentz. Brian is Senior Director of Product Management for Technicolor Connected Home. He will join us from Rennes, France. Okay. Now let's look at today's agenda. As usual, we have a lot to cover the next 60 minutes. I'll quickly run through what we're going to be talking about. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about what is HDR. We'll talk about what the HDR revolution means and how it's coming. We'll talk about where the market stands today for ultra high definition and HDR. We'll talk about why Technicolor is one of the leading players in this field. We'll focus on what the opportunities and challenges are for network service providers. We'll have a couple of case studies near the end. We'll talk about some of the things that Technicolor is mostly focusing on in terms of their branding approach and marketing and sales strategy. And we'll also have a couple of audience polls so we can get your perspective on where you see HDR technology going. Okay, so first let's talk about what is HDR. As you know, it's high dynamic range as opposed to what today's TVs have, which is standard dynamic range, or SDR. Okay, so we have several definitions here that we'll take a quick look at. They pretty much overlap with each other. Basically, HDR increases the difference between the black and white beyond the contrast range of traditional TVs, of what we've had of conventional TVs. So it expands the TV contrast ratio and the color palette so that you can get a more realistic, more brilliant, more vivid picture. As a result, it displays a wide range of colors and much brighter values and much brighter whites and darks. Okay, So let's talk about the HDR revolution and what that means. As you can see here, the whole industry is starting to move to HDR in tandem with the industry's move towards ultra-high definition TV. The two are sort of complementary. What we list here on this slide are some of the four major TV manufacturers that have already come out with premium HDR products or are planning to do so next year. We also talk about what's happening on the content side and some of the agreements, some of the people that are working on that, such as NBC Sports, and Fox, Amazon, and Netflix, all are working on HDR content. Either they've come out with HDR content or they're planning to come out with HDR content. And Technicolor is working with several of these providers, some both on the content side and on the OTT provider side. And we'll be getting into some case studies of what some of these folks are doing, such as what NBC Sports are doing. On the pay TV side, we have a bunch of providers that are now working on HDR as well, mostly on trials. We've seen trials from from Charter Cable and Time Warner. Time Warner is now part of Charter, and we'll be presenting a case study about that later on in this webinar, since Technicolor is working with Time Warner. Comcast has an HDR set-top box that they're working on. We're seeing things from DirecTV as well, and the BBC over in Europe. And also NBC did something with HDR at the Olympics in Rio 2 months ago. Going on to the last part of the slide, we're talking about new HDR devices that are coming on board. We're seeing things from Blu-ray. We're seeing things from Microsoft from the Xbox One, as well as the new Sony PlayStation 4 are all just launched their own HDR-enabled devices. Okay, so now let's look at the major TV manufacturers that have an HDR-compatible TV. These are not HDR-enabled TVs, but these are TVs that can be enabled for HDR with the right software download. So we see you have 9 manufacturers here that have some kind of TV set already out there in the market that can be upgraded for HDR. Okay, here's some stats on where the U.S. market stands in terms of UHD. These stats come to us from the Consumer Technology Association, which used to be the Consumer Electronics Association. Okay, as you can see here, almost 35 million TVs were shipped last year in the U.S. 4 million were UHD TVs, larger than 40-inch screens. This represents only about 11.5% of the total TV sold. But by 2019, it's projected by the CTA that UHD TVs will represent a little more than a third of the U.S. market, or about 34%. So that's where things stand with UHD TVs. Now let's look at HDR, which is sort of a subset of UHD since they go hand in hand. We have stats here both from China and North America. We're going to focus more on the North American market because we think that that's where things are going to be happening first. These are projections, once again. I think these are from IHS as to how many TVs will be sold in North America in 2019. As you can see, the projections are that 42 million total TVs will be sold. Of these, nearly half, 20 million, will be UHD. And of the UHD, about a third, or 6.4 million, will be HDR. So HDR is coming. It's over the next 3 or 4 years, over the rest of the decade, we'll be seeing more and more HDR-enabled and HDR-compatible TVs as it gets built into UHD TVs. Okay, so with that introduction, I'm going to turn things over to Josh Lamore. Josh, as I mentioned earlier, is the Vice President of Technology for Technicolor. So Josh, again, joins us from Los Angeles. It's very early in the morning, so good morning, Josh.
Thank you, Alan. I think, before I move on to my next slide, I think what you presented on the last few slides is very important, especially the last two where you're pointing out that this is a migration process to HDR. Not everything happens instantly. So as we move through these problem statements and what's happening in the marketplace, it's important to pay attention to the fact that we will be in this kind of a mixed SDR and HDR world for not just devices but also for content. And how we address that can be very important to ensure efficient deployment for service providers. So let's talk about the state of HDR for the home. there have been different groups, different standardization groups that have come together to try and help create some standards around what HDR will be. One of those kind of leading the forefront on the quality side and ensuring that there's content, distribution, and devices is the UHD Alliance. So we are one of the founding members of the UHD Alliance in order to establish this standard for HDR for the home. This has led to things like pay TV operators, OTT operators, and Blu-ray players being able to come into existence to distribute HDR content of all different types. And now we're also looking at things like mobile devices, laptops, tablets, things that allow for consumption of HDR content beyond just the living room. And we've been working in this space, and one of the reasons we care about this full ecosystem is Technicolor is an ecosystem company. We as a company exist in basically three major different business units. One of them on the production services side for creating content, so in this case creating HDR content. One part of our business is on the connected home side, creating set-top boxes, creating gateways, and creating ways to distribute HDR content. And then the glue in between those is the technology group, which allows us to develop the technology that enables these types of ecosystems to exist. So in addition to the UHD Alliance, you have SMPTE's been creating specifications around different things like an EOTF called PQ, which is called SMPTE 2084 for how you curve light for distribution. That's been coupled with things like mastering monitor display metadata, which allows you to define how the content was created, what the canvas the content was painted on was. The CTA defined that HDR compatible phrase that was used in the intro. That HDR compatible phrase means it can receive an HDR signal but doesn't necessarily mean that it can present it well or show it to the utmost of its ability. The UHD Alliance was formed as a group that consists of not just studios creating content, but also technology companies, distribution companies, and CE manufacturers to establish what good, high-quality HDR content would be and how it would be well represented. So the UHD Alliance introed a logo called UHD Premium to allow for the recognition of what devices best represent HDR content. So when we talk about HDR content, it's important to look at some predictions about the rollout of that content. And so this is kind of Technicolor's take on the rollout of HDR content. This is not, this is obviously a forecast. So this is kind of our predictions. And a lot of it's proved to be pretty accurate. Part of the reason that it's proved to be pretty accurate is Technicolor's involved in a lot of the efforts to roll this out. So right now, transactional movies are already starting to come online. They've been coming online since the end of last year. We helped to launch Amazon's HDR service, so that's one of the reasons we know that space, creating the majority of their online HDR content, their Amazon originals. But in addition to that, helping them to define the workflow that allowed them to establish HDR content for distribution. Now, and what you'll see towards the end is a case study presenting our work within the live event space. We've been working with different partners like Time Warner Cable Sports Network, now part of Charter, called Spectrum. We've also been working with NBC Sports on Olympics content, which has been announced in the media, to help enable HDR content to exist and start to get the public interested and see this content and understand the benefits that it really offers. Next, we know that premium networks will be able to come online. Some of that testing is just about to start. Really, they're coming next mostly because they need the distribution path from the pay TV operators. And then broadcast cable, a lot of standardization work's going on around ATSC or DVB to help define what the broadcast specification will be to allow for carrying of HDR content. And we are involved there as well, being that we are an open standards company. So I think this takes us to our first poll question. I'll hand it back to Alan for that.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Josh. It's great to be able to forecast things that you can control. I wish we could do that at heavy reading. That would make our jobs a lot easier. All right, so that brings, as Josh mentioned, that brings us to our first audience poll of the day. The question here is, when do you plan to roll out HDR services? We give you 4 choices. The 4 choices are the first half of 2017. Second choice is the second half of next year. Third choice is we're working on it, but probably not before 2018. And the fourth choice is I don't know, we're not working on it now. I wish we'd given people 2019 choice, but next time around we'll do that. So it'll take a few moments for the On24 system to collect all the results. If you want to ask either Josh or Brian a question while you're waiting, just type your query into the Ask a Question text area and then click the Submit button. In the meantime, let's bring back Josh for a quick question, and Josh will be taking over the presentation again once we're through. Josh, that's amazing forecast. So what do you see happening over the next year along the different curves? Are we going to see more on the content side, or see more on the service provider side?
I think a little bit of both. The
Okay.
reality is the content and the service provider happen hand in hand.
Right.
One of the limitations on the service provider side has just been the physical limitation of rolling out set-top boxes. They take time. And so now chipsets exist with new technology in it. People can start writing their RFPs to be able to do the request for new set-top boxes, and hardware can start to roll out. And I know that Brian's going to show some examples of that later on.
Okay. Thanks, Josh. Let's take a look at the answers here. Looks like the biggest portion say they don't know yet. They're not working on HDR technology right now. A little more than a third said that. Close behind is people saying that they're going to be rolling it out in the second half of next year. Almost a third said that. And then right behind that, people working on it, but probably not before 2018. So we have about 60%, a little more than 60% saying either the second half of next year or in 2018, and then another almost 8% saying the first half of 2017. All in all, this is actually more aggressive than I would have expected. Josh, is this what you're hearing from your customers, or are you surprised by this as well?
I think it pretty well lines up with the predictions that we were saying. You know, as content comes online and as people have more content that they can start to present, it makes a lot of sense to have this ramp up beginning towards second half of 2017 and into 2018 makes a lot of sense, because I think what we'll see is we've already started to see some of the HDR TVs come on the marketplace.
Right.
We'll see more of that announced at CES in 2017. People are starting, even the CE manufacturers are starting to figure out what the problems with the devices they introduced were and how to fix that. So I think it makes a lot of sense to see 2017 as kind of the beginning of the ramp-up period for service providers.
Right, and it'll be interesting when we do a webinar like this in, say, 6 months or a year to see how the numbers change. I bet that last number, the 34.6%, is going to go down a lot, but we shall see how that goes. But in the meantime, let me turn things back over to Josh for the rest of his presentation.
Thank you. So we talked a little bit about how Technicolor has been involved in these open standards groups. One of the reasons is Technicolor has always been focused on open approaches to anything. Being an ecosystem company, we focus very much on the open ecosystem because any little change, any big change like HDR affects our entire business. So here we've actually launched a website called openhdr.com. You'll see that at the bottom. The goal here is to talk about content creation for open standards for HDR, talk about distribution, consumption, what devices are, and really highlight how we move together towards this open HDR future where everyone can create HDR content, everyone can create an HDR display, and you can allow an ecosystem to grow and flourish. So it's important for us to highlight that, and please feel free to visit that website. So we'll step into the meat of our presentation today, which is the implementation challenges. And as you can imagine, they're probably numerous. We tried to narrow it down to kind of focus on 5. I'll present the first 2 of these, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Brian, who will present the next 3. We really wanted to focus on some of the top challenges we've been hearing. First and foremost, how do you create HDR content? What do I do when I don't have HDR content? Things like that. Second, everyone's talking about multiple formats of HDR. So we have this world that's not just going to be mixed of standard dynamic range content and devices, but also high dynamic range content and devices. but not just high dynamic range content and devices, multiple different types of high dynamic range that have been discussed and that are existing in the marketplace. So we'll talk about that challenge there. Constant viewing experience. When I have all these varieties of different HDR and SDR content, how do I ensure that my consumer is receiving the experience, whether it's SDR or HDR, receiving that same high-quality experience no matter what their device is? Households, of course, will have a mixture of HDR and SDR devices. As you can imagine, if you buy a brand new HDR TV for your living room, it's likely you're not going to throw away your beautiful 65-inch TV that you had that was standard dynamic range. You're going to move that somewhere else. So now you're going to have a world, you're going to have, even within your house, mixed formats that you have to pay attention to. And then, of course, with things like HDR compatible and HDR capable devices and various different HDR capable devices, you're going to have a variety of different things labeled HDR that are devices. And so how do you address different devices that are all labeled with the same three-letter acronym of HDR? Let's dive in, and before we do that, I just wanted to bring up two different pieces of technology that Technicolor has developed to help kind of address some of these problems that we've heard from the marketplace. First one, called Technicolor HDR. It's a distribution technology. What it allows you to do is take in any format of content, and I say any format of content because it can be PQ content. PQ is that EOTF curve established by SMPTE. It can be HLG HDR content. HLG is a different curve that's been established in BT 2100 for European content creation and the International Program Exchange. And it can be SDR content. In fact, we designed this flexible enough so that it can even take in native log production formats like Sony's S-Log3, which they've been promoting for live sports production. The Technicolor HDR is a universal distribution platform that allows you to bring in any format of content and distribute it appropriately to any device in the home. We have standardized this. So we standardized it within Etsy. You'll see the Etsy number on that slide. And we've also submitted it for broadcast standards and different distribution standards to allow for anyone in the ecosystem to be able to leverage this type of technology. We did win an award from Light Reading, so thank you for that to our people hosting this presentation. I think we're very appreciative of that award. And it's very important, this technology, to allow for this mixed format world that we're going to be entering into. Technicolor HDR ITM is the second piece of technology that we're showing, and I'll show you how these apply in the different use cases. But the Technicolor HDR ITM is specifically a technology to allow us to take standard dynamic range content and map it to a high dynamic range experience. Will this be as good as native HDR? The reality is we can never get as good as native HDR because the detail is not there. But it is a technology that allows your consumer to not necessarily see the difference between standard dynamic range and high dynamic range content, allowing for normalizing that HDR experience to the consumer. So the first problem statement we wanted to address was optimizing production workflows. Here we have a mixture of HDR and SDR content, right? You have a production environment where you may have all standard dynamic range equipment. You likely do have all standard dynamic range equipment today. And you'll want to pay attention to how do I deal with an environment where I have all standard dynamic range content, or standard dynamic range cameras, a standard dynamic range infrastructure, and how do I migrate to HDR now? In addition to that, what if I want to add some choice cameras that are HDR and intermix that with some SDR cameras? Things like that that I need to pay attention to as I migrate to HDR. How can I do it cost effectively and still present the benefits to my consumer? So we look at the different methods. First and foremost, optimal, best possible way to create HDR content, start with HDR cameras. Of course, that makes sense. I still have to deal with a distribution challenge, which is if I do an all HDR production and I'm doing a live production, it's likely that I'm going to do one production. I'm not going to do simultaneously an HDR and an SDR production. So in that case, I need the ability to do an HDR production but still be able to distribute HDR and SDR to my consumers. One example of a method to do this is Technicolor's HDR technology, our distribution platform, which allows you to take in that HDR content and distribute it as SDR and HDR in a single feed down to the home. We talked about that use case of mixing HDR and SDR formats, which is probably more likely in the near term. We've done some of this work already, and so we can say confidently that this works. But the reality is, if I have 40 cameras in a stadium, it's likely I don't have the budget to replace all 40 cameras within my infrastructure. So in this example, I have 4 cameras I've decided to replace that are my choice HDR cameras. And I have the majority of my cameras, the pole cam, the helmet cam, the spider cam, things that really are not accessible by these new HDR cameras yet, that are standard dynamic range. So Technicolor's HDR ITM technology is an example of something that allows you to upconvert that standard dynamic range content and intercut it with high dynamic range content. Now, as a sports producer, I'm able to do a production much more cost effectively without having to change out my entire infrastructure and be able to intercut and take advantage of some of these new HDR cameras. And of course, this all started with work that we did that was all standard dynamic range. So one of the things that we'll show you later on is a case study that we worked on with Time Warner Cable Sports, now called Spectrum, which allowed us to take a standard dynamic range production, all standard dynamic range, leveraging the power of Technicolor's ITM technology, upconvert it to high dynamic range, and distribute that as one single stream down to the back-end devices that were receiving it. Of course, once you've solved and figured out how to create HDR content, you still have to live in this mixed format world with standard dynamic range, high dynamic range of various different types. All these different EOTFs, electro-optical transfer functions, need to coexist, and this is where Technicolor's distribution technology really comes into play. In this example, you'll see a mixture of different content. I use this mostly just to show you a high 10,000 feet view of the entire ecosystem, the way that you'll see it as content is created. So here's an example of where sports content has been created in S-Log3. That S-Log3 is that proprietary Sony format for sports production. That proprietary high dynamic range format needs to be intercut with standard dynamic range commercials, with maybe a PQ or SMPTE 2084 commercial, maybe even this new HLG curve from BT 2100. But you're going to have this mix of content feeding into a single playout server. So Technicolor's HDR technology for distribution allows you to take in any of this content and distribute it through one single stream. It normalizes the distribution to the home and ensures that that one single stream can hit every single device on the back end. One additional advantage here is as we deploy this, we're actually going to redeploy the Presented in Technicolor logo. The Presented in Technicolor HDR will be able to be a moniker that's on content that will be presented through our distribution technology. What you'll see on the right side of this slide is an example of a set-top box. Once it's receiving that stream, literally can hit any device within the home, and you'll see how that becomes useful as we dive into the next few slides. And I'll hand it over to Brian, who will take over and present the next few use cases. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. So, yeah, as Josh mentioned, there's going to be a lot of different content coming to the home, SDR and HDR, and it's really critical to deliver a consistent viewing experience, and that's definitely a challenge. And this is a example timeline of how this might work using sports content. So you have on the left-hand side, you have sports coming in, produced in Sony S-Log3, EOTF, and then that's followed by a commercial that was done in SDR, and then followed by a commercial that was done in PQ EOTF. So this is just, I think, a real-world example of what's going to be typical in the early days of mixed SDR and HDR. And Josh mentioned the ITM technology, where in 4K world, the TVs, I would say, do a pretty good job of HD to 4K upscaling. We haven't seen that in the HDR world, where the up conversion from from SDR to HDR can really vary widely. And doing this real time in a set-top box gives you a couple advantages. One, you know the quality that you can deliver, and it can be consistent. And two, you can use it across all the content. So any SDR content coming in can be up-converted to HDR. And so this is really, what the user wants to see is, a consistent experience, and that can definitely be delivered well by doing the ITM conversion in the set-top box. There's also a note here on the bottom that I think is interesting. Ads with different brightness levels could introduce government-issued CALM-style legislation again. So similar to what we experienced a while back in the audio world, now we're going to have different levels of brightness capability in the commercials. So another challenge is going to be that I think most households for a long time are going to have both HDR and SDR devices. And I think a great example of that is, what if you want to record a program that you're watching on an HDR TV/DVR and then watch it on a different TV, on an SDR TV set-top box in another room? How is that going to be handled? And this shows an example of how that could be handled, as well as other use cases. So here you have the HDR DVR set-top box where the recording's done, and using the Technicolor HDR, that can then be sent over to the SDR set-top box and SDR TV and deliver a high-quality viewing experience to both. And of course, that could also be done with the standard linear content that's not recorded as well. So another problem is there's a highly varying quality of HDR TVs, the display tuning, the tone mapping solutions that are out there. And one way of solving that is to tone map within the set-top box so that you can deliver, again, a high-quality, consistent experience. And this shows, I think, a typical scenario where you have HDR TVs that have different levels of peak luminance. So the UHD Alliance that Josh mentioned, they have a couple different targets, 1,000 nits for LCD and then 540 nits for OLED. But we know already there's widely varying peak luminance levels. We expect to see 1,500 nits on the LCD side, 650 plus nits on the OLED side. And one of the challenges is if the content is significantly different than that in terms of peak luminance, you can have issues like clipping or other artifacts. And of course, you also have the SDR displays that are going to be in the home as well. So having an HDR signal brought to the home through the combination of SDR plus metadata that changes dynamically on a scene-by-scene basis is a way of really optimizing to the quality and the brightness level of the display. So now move into HDR set-top boxes. As Josh mentioned, one of the challenges so far in HDR deployment has been the availability of cost-effective set-top boxes that support advanced HDR. Technicolor has a new lineup of set-top boxes that we started to demonstrate at IBC this year, leveraging SoCs that have integrated advanced HDR technology. And we're supporting a broad level of support and feature set. The software includes Android TV and RDK. We support 4K P60, Wi-Fi solutions, 2x2 AC for smaller form factors, and 2x4 AC for the very best in terms of Wi-Fi performance. These are dual-core or quad-core based set-top boxes delivering 7K to 14K DMIPs and can be used in any of the video delivery environments, OTT, IP, cable, or satellite. And there's options on several of the boxes for terrestrial tuners as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alan.
Okay, Brian, thanks very much. We're going to get a little bit more into set-top boxes a little bit later, but first we're going to do our second audience poll of the day, so please take a look at your screens. The question this time is, what do you see as the biggest hurdle to deploying HDR? This time we give you 6 choices. The choices are multiple conflicting HDR formats. Second is lack of HDR-enabled TVs in consumer homes. Third is lack of HDR-enabled content. Fourth is the need to integrate HDR with UHD technology. Fifth is lack of bandwidth on the service provider side. And sixth is none of the above. So once again, it'll take a few moments for the ON24 system to collect all the results. If you want to ask either Josh or Brian a question while you're waiting, once again, just type your query into the Ask a Question text area and then click the Submit button. In the meantime, Brian, let's talk a little bit more about set-top boxes. How do you see the market getting populated with set-top boxes, with HDR set-top boxes over the next year? And is that a mature technology now?
Yeah, it aligns really well with the earlier poll answers in terms of second half 17 really ramping in terms of HDR deployment. Mm-hmm. So we will have a number of set-top boxes available that can support that time frame. And I also see that, just like with 4K, operators see this coming and want to support it, even if the deployment time frame is even beyond 2018. I think you'll see operators start to deploy advanced HDR-capable boxes before that, to really optimize their cost to deploy the boxes. So I think you'll start seeing the future-proofing of HDR really early in 2017.
All right, so I can start heading out to Best Buy and looking for boxes soon. Okay, thanks.
That's right.
All right, so let's look at the poll results. Let's see, the leading choice looks like it is multiple conflicting formats is the biggest hurdle, slightly over a third, 34% chose that. Next in line looks like is lack of HDR-enabled TVs, 22.6%. And we also have a lack of HDR-enabled content and lack of bandwidth up there at a slightly over 14%. Not too surprised, because we've heard a lot about how the conflicting formats are the biggest problem, but I'm surprised the lack of HDR-enabled TVs or lack of HDR-enabled content didn't come in higher. Brian, anything here jump out at you, or is this pretty much what you're hearing from the market right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised that multiple conflicting formats is the highest one, just from, I think there's a general fear of that out there, and probably, there's a lot of standards to really catch up on and really understand. But again, I really think that that's where you need a flexible technology that can handle all of those different inputs on the format side.
Okay. Very good. Just putting in the latest results there. So thanks to everybody who participated in both our polls, and thank you to Brian. Now we're going to switch from Brian in France back to Josh in Los Angeles to take us through some case studies. So Josh, take it away.
Thank you. So I wanted to take us through one, and then maybe we'll open it up for some questions, and then I have a few more that I can present as well, if it makes sense. But the first case study that I wanted to present is what we've done live with Time Warner Cable Sports, with Major League Baseball and the Dodgers, and now Spectrum. Basically, what we were able to do here was that one of those live production use cases where I said, what would you do if you had all standard dynamic range infrastructure? So the major challenge here was, without changing really anything to an infrastructure, how can you go ahead and migrate to high dynamic range? So from Dodger Stadium, we took the standard dynamic range feed via the Time Warner Cable backbone. That feed was brought back to El Segundo. It was all standard dynamic range, no changes to the cameras. All the ads, all the archival content, the interstitials, everything was added to that channel, to that game, in real time, all in standard dynamic range. The entire standard dynamic range production was then up-converted in real time through Technicolor HDR ITM. It was up-converted to HDR. This was the first step. The reason that this is the first step and it's up-converted to HDR is because of that near-term solution, right, where you might want to be able to intercut some native HDR content and standard dynamic range content. So in real time, up to 4K P60 now, you can up-convert standard dynamic range content to high dynamic range, and you could intercut high dynamic range content, so now you can intermix different formats of content. Once that's all in high dynamic range, we're able to then take that through our distribution technology, which is what we did here. It was deconstructed to standard dynamic range plus metadata. The reason we take this first step of deconstructing it to standard dynamic range plus metadata is it allows for it to be directly compatible with your entire infrastructure. It allows it to be directly compatible with all of your customers' homes and your customer set-top boxes today. So once it's SDR plus metadata, that can then be encoded through a typical HEVC encoder, and the metadata is inserted into what's standardized called SCI messages. So these are carried along with the stream. It's not a separate sidecar piece of metadata. It's actually embedded with the stream so that they don't get separated. So that HEVC video and that SCI message is packed into a transport stream, which is packaged and then sent through Colorado, from Colorado back to distribution. So in this case, it was sent to El Segundo, it was sent to Los Angeles, and it was sent to New York all at the same time over the Time Warner cable backbone without modifying any of their infrastructure. So here they were able to take that HEVC stream, send it to these three locations, and in real time, it was presented to a typical standard dynamic range set-top box, where it presented to standard dynamic range TV with the SDR version of the content, and a high dynamic range set-top box, which reincorporated the metadata and presented high dynamic range to the screen. So in real time, without modifying their infrastructure, they had one stream which was sending to all devices and able to present both standard dynamic range and high dynamic range to the home. This I present as a live end-to-end. We've done this. This was a cable infrastructure. We've done this with satellite infrastructures over Europe. And we've even done it with ATSC 3.0 tests within Korea to show that really any typical infrastructure can carry our distribution format without causing harm to any metadata, without causing harm to any of the distribution, and presenting both signals to the home and allowing both HDR and SDR customers to take advantage of it. So with that, I'd like to say thank you and hand it over to Alan and to the group if there are questions that anyone has, and if you guys want me to dig into more use cases, I can do that as well.
Thanks, Josh. Really interesting stuff, and I suspect we will want you to dig into more use cases. But let's start by taking a couple of questions from the audience first. His first question: it might not be realistic to think that a single channel will send a mix of SDR and HDR content, but switching from an HDR to SDR channel will be a real problem. Can placing ITM in set-top box deliver a consistent HDR/SDR image? And will there be a timed delay?
I'll take that one, Alan.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for the question. It's a very good question. So the combination of Technicolor HDR and Technicolor HDR ITM, we actually bundle under the banner Advanced HDR by Technicolor. When a device carries this moniker, it's able to take in these mixed formats of content. It's able to take in standard dynamic range content and seamlessly switch between that incoming content and always presenting a high-quality HDR experience to the consumer. So there is no difference, no delay, no black frame. None of that's happening with our distribution. What's happening is all HDR content and SDR content, if it's been up-converted, goes through a distribution platform. That is then distributed as one single stream. as SDR plus metadata. What happens is that SDR plus metadata goes down to the set-top box. If it has that metadata, it rehydrates to the HDR stream and presents HDR to that HDR screen. If it's SDR content, it won't have that metadata. Because of the lack of that metadata, it will kick in the function that is ITM and be able to upconvert to HDR. So now seamlessly within a single stream, a broadcaster or distributor of content can take in all HDR formats and SDR content and distribute it to a set-top box that can handle all of that in real time and present it appropriately to the customer.
Very good. Thanks for the comprehensive explanation, Josh.
No problem.
Sure. Next question. How much extra network bandwidth does HDR use relative to SDR? And do you feel need for a bandwidth reduction technology to help with this? This gets into one of the things that came up in our second poll question.
I can take that one as well.
Okay. Go for it, Josh.
So the typical recommendation of anyone moving to HDR is to increase your bandwidth by about 15%. Some of the proprietary technology out there recommends to increase about 20 to 25%, and that can be very problematic. Some of the tests that we've done with Technicolor HDR, because it is deconstructing it to standard dynamic range plus metadata, actually has shown that we have a bandwidth efficiency increase, which allows you to stay at a similar level that you would want for HEVC and be able to embed in that single stream both the HDR and the SDR feed. So instead of you having to duplicate for HDR and SDR distribution, you can actually take in one stream. You can take it in one stream. The metadata that we add adds only basically 0.05% increase, so very, very minimal overhead.
Right.
But the HEVC stream itself can be of a comparable bit rate that you would expect a typical HEVC file or stream to be.
Excellent. Okay, thanks, Josh. This next question might be for Brian or might be for both of you. You can decide. The questioner says, OTT providers have a major advantage regarding set-top boxes, upgrades, truck rolls, etc. Is HDR going to be exclusively OTT, or is it going to be, throughout the pay TV spectrum?
Yeah, Alan, this is Brian. No, I think OTT is definitely leading the way. It's the first out of the box because of that, advantage. But as Josh mentioned, we're working with a number of operators now on testing. Time Warner Cable was mentioned, and I think really live events and live sports are driving that. And I think that was one of the really great things about the result of the Time Warner Cable Dodgers game was that we could see the really good quality that could be achieved with the existing infrastructure of cameras. And so I think you'll see a OTT operators roll out HDR with live content starting next year.
Do you think it'll be cable first or satellite first, or about even Steven? Or telco first?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that'll be a good battle to watch. If you look at the 4K, it was satellite was first out the door. It's a little bit easier in terms of distribution. But now with really distribution over IP, regardless of whether it's cable or telco, I think it's going to be an interesting one to watch to see who actually comes out first.
Sure. Josh, did you want to jump in on that?
I think we've I can jump in a little bit. I think we've seen OTT already rolling out content, and so clearly they have an easier route to deployment. Mm-hmm. But you've already seen, for instance, Comcast and NBC Sports announced that they showed the opening ceremony of the Olympics in HDR. What was interesting about that was then NBC Sports distributed 80 hours plus of sports content in HDR.
Right.
It did leverage our technology, but they distributed those 80 hours over their Xfinity app on a smart TV from Samsung. So even the traditional paid TV operators are starting to look at distribution through platforms like their OTT app as maybe an exclusive route to get some of their content out there.
Excellent. Okay. Very good. Thank you both, guys. Let's turn back to some additional case studies, as you mentioned earlier, Josh. What else do you have for us there?
Sure. So I can go ahead and switch to those. First up is an announcement we made with Vubiquity. Vubiquity is an aggregator of content. It really facilitates with the distribution of content for different outlets. And they represent several OTT pieces of content being distributed, but also about 700 linear channels worldwide. The announcement we made with them is the ability for them to leverage both Technicolor HDR and our ITM technology to be able to take in SDR content, HDR content, mixture of HDR and SDR formats, be able to take all of it in and allow their customers to be able to do an HDR distribution of any program. That HDR distribution of any program is distributed through Technicolor HDR, which allows it to be that one stream, that's SDR plus metadata, and allows people to go ahead and migrate to distributing now, even if they don't have set-top boxes that are HDR compatible today. Meaning that they can go ahead and take in any content, start distributing the channels, and start to roll out set-top boxes as their infrastructure becomes ready for it, as they start to roll out the HDR-compatible set-top boxes. But the channels can go ahead and switch over now. And that's one of the key advantages is now you're able to start deploying the signals, testing your entire infrastructure, getting everything ready, and then start to roll out the set-top boxes, as opposed to having to deal with the challenge of simultaneously standing up two different methods, two different infrastructures, and be able to distribute it. So this is a very big announcement that we did with Vubiquity, which now their customers are able to leverage and have already started to distribute content through this method, none the wiser to the end consumers.
Very good, Josh. We're going to take some more questions from the audience, but right now I just want to put up a evaluation form on your screens so you can let us know what you liked and what you didn't like about this webinar and give us some feedback. Please also let us know. Oh, I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong slide there. Let me make sure I get the right slide there. Okay. Please also let us know what you'd like us to cover in the future. And also if you have any desire to meet or talk to Technicolor about their technology, please let us know as well. To complete the form, just please press the Submit Answer button at the bottom of the page. Thanks. Okay, so while you're doing that, Josh, you want to present another case study, or we can go back to questions?
Seeing that we have only a few minutes left, let's ask some more questions.
Okay, sure. Here we go. Are you seeing any interest in applying HDR to 1080p content?
Absolutely. I think that's a very easy one to answer. I think a lot of the sports content, a lot of the broadcasters are actually looking at 1080p as a method for distributing HDR. The reason being, moving to UHD to them requires a lot more bandwidth than the move to HDR, and the advantages of moving to HDR itself are much more readily recognizable by the consumer. So there's a lot of interest in moving to that 1080p HDR space.
Okay, fair enough. Next question. We got a lot in, which is a great sign here. Can the existing infrastructure handle this level of high bandwidth? You got into that a little bit before, but you want to say more?
Yeah, so that case study that I presented for Time Warner Cable Sports, that was the existing infrastructure, no changes to the existing infrastructure. It allowed for real-time implementation of all of the technology, and it was distributed using Technicolor HDR. So in real time, with just what was added was a server to do the actual functionality, to do the up conversion and the distribution pre-processing. But other than that, the entire infrastructure didn't change. It was exactly the infrastructure of Time Warner Cable, exactly the infrastructure of Spectrum now. Okay, very good. Next question. When up-converting SDR content, how do you determine what metadata to use? For example, how much brighter or more rich? Is it some form of standard algorithm? It's a very good question. There is no standard on creating content. So if someone's going to create native HDR content, really the way that the industry has defined it is as a canvas approach, and you define all the paints and the colors that someone has available.
Right.
So by defining this master canvas or mastering display metadata, for example, it defines what that monitor is, and then the colors can make the content any way that they see fit. When you're doing up conversion, the goal is to match the experience while maintaining what the creative intended in standard dynamic range content. So the goal is kind of blending what is a native HDR grade or native HDR content, intercutting it with the standard dynamic range, paying attention to hitting that same kind of experience and feel. But of course, the wonderful challenge with any up conversion is maintaining true to the creative intent. So when we created our ITM, it was with colors. The research that was done, anything that was done to comment on how it was doing expansion, was all with the creative community as part of the process. So it's not just a typical linear expansion. You know, everyone can claim they do something to upconvert, but the reality is this is the only thing that has been worked through with Hollywood, with colorists, with the creative talent to ensure that what we're doing is true to the creative intent, as true as can be in this new HDR space. Okay,
thanks, Josh. We're giving you a lot of work here. Next question. Some devices are able to convert SDR to HDR on the fly. Will that become relevant in the HDR market?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, this is something that is available today in set-top boxes that I talked about earlier in the new product lineup. We have ITM, up conversion, real time, and as we talked about, a lot of the content is still going to be SDR, and so the ability to have a consistent viewing experience with SDR and HDR content, I think, is going to be really critical.
Very good. Thanks, Brian.
I would add, if you don't mind,
Alan,
I'd like to add one thing to that, which is it's not just about being able to upconvert it. It's about being able to seamlessly upconvert it. As someone asked earlier, a device that's capable of doing upconversion doesn't solve the entire problem.
Right.
The reality is, to the consumer, it needs to be seamless. And so you need the ability for you to intercut HDR and SDR content, ensure that the consumer on the back end will always have that seamless experience. The same is true on the SDR side. If I'm intercutting HDR and SDR content because I want to do one program, I need to make sure that my SDR customer is always receiving that seamless SDR experience.
Okay, thanks for the addition, Josh.
Absolutely.
Are you seeing content producers as keen adopters of HDR production equipment? Will they drive the migration in the market, or will TV manufacturers once again be the drivers?
One thing I'd like to say is this is the first time in quite a while that I'm happy to say it's a group on both sides. So the UHD Alliance was formed very much for this purpose. When 4K came out, the question asker is very, very accurately pointing out, when 4K came out, the TV drivers, the TV manufacturers are the ones who drove it. The reality is that became problematic because the content creators didn't necessarily create enough 4K content to fill that ecosystem.
Right.
Here, the UHD Alliance has come together as a group that includes content creators, includes CE manufacturers, includes distributors, includes technology companies to ensure that we all work together to bring this up together. And so in real time, you have TV manufacturers making to a specification. You have content creators already making content to that open specification. And you have distribution companies who are bridging that gap between those two sides, ensuring that they're maintaining the high quality of the content on those devices.
Very good, Josh. Well, we're approaching the top of the hour, but the questions are still flooding in, so we're going to take a couple more questions. We'll go a little bit past the top of the hour just to let everybody else out there know. Here's a good one for one of you, or both. When do you expect HDR to happen on mobile devices?
I know that we've already seen some of that, right? The Samsung Galaxy Note 7 that rolled into the marketplace announced itself to be an HDR device. The Sony also announced an HDR device, but that one has not yet come to market. So we're starting to see it become apparent, but there aren't yet established, let's say, levels of quality yet, as there are with the TV devices. So with TV devices, there are those kind of established metrics,
right,
by the UHD Alliance, so that we can say what is something that is HDR capable. With mobile devices, that doesn't exist yet, and so I think we still need to allow for time for those devices and the hardware in those devices to mature to allow for mobile to present that similar premium experience that TVs are capable of doing.
Okay. Thanks, Josh.
No problem.
What is the SDR to HDR upconvert doing to the content? Since you're not adding extra color information to the image, is it more like a format change instead of the content itself?
Another very good question. I'm glad everyone is listening and asking very good questions. The upconversion, or any upconversion, can happen in a few different ways. One of those you could do, for instance, is a linear upconversion, which would just kind of stretch out the gamma and lose detail, but make it brighter. That's clearly not what we want to do. Another would be to just make that SDR look like SDR in the HDR space. The way that we're doing it is neither of those. What we're doing is actually analyzing the image on a pixel-by-pixel basis and creating an expansion map that segments the image and does the expansion in real time, allowing for gradual gradations and changes in the image within a single frame. So for instance, if you look at cloud detail, what we're able to do is introduce some of the subtleties by picking up on those subtleties. We're able to introduce that subtle detail into the high dynamic range image. So very different than a static lookup table or any kind of linear expansion. It's actually analyzing the image and picking up on those subtleties to create a natural version of that content in an expanded HDR space. Okay.
Thanks, Josh. We're going to have to wrap things up now, but I just want a quick question for both you and Brian. A year from now, when we hold this webinar with you guys again, how do you think things will have changed? How will the market have changed?
Great question. I think if you look at, for instance, the prediction slides that you presented in the beginning, you're going to see a lot more HDR, not just HDR compatible devices, but HDR capable devices come into the marketplace now that you kind of have a benchmark or a target for CE manufacturers to go ahead and manufacture. In addition to that, I think what you're going to see is better and better devices. So standard dynamic range was around for a long time, and people worked on perfecting and making the devices better and better represent the content in bright living room environments or even screens that could be outdoors. I think what we're going to see is, now that we know what the content is and how to make it, you can now see the CE manufacturers make devices not just to spec, but improve upon those, make those even better. And hopefully, and I believe, we'll see those over the next couple of years. Okay. Brian, you get the last word if you want it.
Sure. Yeah, I would say on the set-top box side, we're going to see HDR become, advanced HDR capability become more commonplace, and so that'll be there to support the rollouts that we saw that are coming in second half of 2017.
Okay. Well, thanks. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I want to thank everyone out there for attending, and I want to thank our two main speakers, Josh Lamore and Brian Jentz of Technicolor, for the presentations and insights today. Let's give them both some warm virtual applause. This webinar will be archived on the Light Reading website by the end of the week. Within the next 24 to 48 hours, you should receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. So feel free to review the webinar whenever you'd like over the next year. This webinar is copyright 2016 by Light Reading. The presentation materials are owned or copyrighted by Light Reading and Technicolor. These companies and their speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of Light Reading, Technicolor, and our presenters, thanks very much for tuning in today. Take care, everybody.